All right, I will start with my introductory notes. My name is Emily Davidson, and I'm one of the research assistants for the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. Our director, Charmaine Nelson, sends her regrets for today's session, and so I'll be doing the introductory notes and introducing our speaker, Bruno Véras. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery at NSCAD University is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties, which the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands or resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. The Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery was founded in 2020 by its inaugural director, Professor Charmaine A. Nelson. The Institute facilitates, promotes, and disseminates research on Canadian slavery and comparative research between the regions which became Canada and other nations or colonies. The Institute is proud to advance the public's understanding of the complex histories of Canadian slavery and its legacies through lectures like today's program with Bruno R. Véras. Bruno Véras is a digital historian and cultural producer native of Recife, Brazil. His research interests include African diasporas, West African history, and the transnational history of slavery and the memory of slavery and reparations. His work also focuses and engages with public history, digital humanities, art education, and creative scholarship. He has served as a researcher and a consultant for experimental drawing exhibits, theater plays based on biographies of enslaved Africans, dance performances, and experimental fictional television series. He has been a contributing and executive advisory board member, or contributing to the executive or an advisory board member for the Harriet Tubman Institute, the Center for Research of Latin American and the Caribbean, and the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. He is currently a PhD candidate in history at York University and the director of the art-based public history UNESCO project, Fragments of Memory, Artistic Representations of Diaspora Lives, Slave Route Project, UNESCO. Bruno is going to present for about 30 to 40 minutes, and that will be followed by a question period. During the question period, you can either unmute yourself to ask a question, or you can type it into the chat, and I will relay questions. So if you have a question that comes up during the presentation, you can type it into the chat, and we'll add those to the question period at the end. And just a reminder that today's session is being recorded and that we'll make it available online at a later date. Go ahead, Bruno.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today online to talk to you about my fellowship research at the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery with really amazing other fellows, with Emily, Professor Charmaine Nelson. It's a real great pleasure to work in such a nice environment, even though it's online. But I love when I have a chance to have meetings and engage and talk to everybody, such great scholars and artists. And all this interaction actually helped me to shape my questions, to shape my methodology, my approaches for this research that I'm going to present to you today. And was also great for my PhD dissertation that I'm trying to wrap up and write and maybe finish, not maybe, I will. And a part of this research is going to be part of a chapter, a special chapter where I deal with the press, with the international press, and the coverage of this international press in, I think, 9 or 10 different languages of slave rebellions in Brazil. So yes, today we are going to talk especially about the Canadian press. I'm going to share my screen here with you. Let me see, share screen. I think now you can see my screen, my PowerPoint presentation that hopefully is going to fit in 30, 40 minutes. And we can have our session for questions, hopefully not hard ones. And today, my presentation is divided in maybe 4 parts. We're going to have a very brief introduction on the slave trade and see the transatlantic African slave trade and see how this would fit in the Canadian context. Canada was not out of that, as I'm going to say and show. We are going to talk a bit about the events in Africa, because to understand the transatlantic slave trade in the Americas, in Canada, we should not forget about the events happening in the hinterlands of Africa. And it's very important in the case of the Malay uprising in Brazil to understand what was happening, not just to the coast, but also close to the Sahara border, the Sahel, where is today northern Nigeria, part of Benin, and Niger, and Chad. Usually when we talk about transatlantic slave trade, people tend to think about just about the Atlantic coast, you know, like slavery and colonization really affected different places, and different places in the hinterlands of Africa answered to this demand. Then hopefully everybody is going to be able to squeeze the eye and look at some newspaper articles that I want to show you. And the same way I got to squeeze my eyes to read and analyze them, you have your chance. I'm going to have them here on the PowerPoint. And finally, we're going to try to do a more theoretical exercise after looking at this at the newspaper information. That's mainly the sources that I'm going to present today, and think about some connections between fear, white fear. That's something that I'm conceptualizing when we talk about slave rebellions everywhere, and we can see that in the newspapers. Slavery, abolition, and colonial dynamics is going to be clear by the end of my presentation when I try to wrap up and think about that in a more conceptual level. And during my presentation, to try to not have these as boring as I thought this would be, I have like some videos that I want to share with you, and we are going to try to watch these I don't know, 1 minute video, 2 minute video explaining some of the things that I am going to discuss with you. So yes, the transatlantic slave trade. It was one of the biggest events of forced migration in human history. So we are not talking about here about US history or Caribbean history or Canadian history or Brazilian history. We're really talking about a very important event and a long one in human history. I have here a short video I want to show you. I'm also going to present you, mention some websites and databases that are quite useful for people wanting to know more about slavery, from Chile to Canada, as I have here in my PowerPoint. And this animated map came from a website called Slave Voyages. It's a website in 3 different languages. Maybe Emily can write down the chat and people can access. And it's an amazing resource. It's one of the main digital humanities projects, I would say, around the world. It's really important. They have documented the thousands of travels, of slave voyages from different parts of Africa to the Americas, and also the inter-American trade between the Caribbean and Halifax, between the Caribbean and Quebec, and other parts of North America. And this map here gives us a dimension. Each little dot here is a ship, is a slave ship, traveling with, depending on the time and the size of the ship, with 200 men, women, and children, especially by the end of the transatlantic slave trade. Many children were brought in these ships to Cuba, to Brazil, to US, to Haiti, and also to Canada. And yes, just for you guys to have a sense of that, 1833 slavery is abolished in the British domains. But in the presentation, we will also talk a little bit about that, about abolition and also trade in African labor commodities. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Let me pause here. Presentation mode. So yes, as I was mentioning, 12.5 million people were transported, were brought from Africa, from their families and native places to different parts of the America to be slaves, to work as a slave, to be exploited, to have their labor, their spring, and their sex exploited. And this is what composed the African diasporas that we discussed today, result of the transatlantic slave trade. And it's a phenomenon that affected from Chile down to the bottom south of South America to Canada. In the Maritimes, colonies in Canada had a special role of participation on that, from building slave ships to receiving and exploring enslaved population, enslaved African and indigenous population. This is the map, also from slave voyages, talking about the numbers. Brazil received almost half of all the Africans being transported from Africa to the Americas. And the history, as I mentioned, of the Central Sudan, the Sahel region of West Africa, northern Nigeria, was key for us to understand the population and the ethnic groups being transported from West Africa to, in my case, of my research, to Brazil. The late 18th century and early 19th century was a time of revolutions, not just as Hobsbawm analyzed for Europe, for Latin America, and for North America, but was also the case for the hinterlands of West Africa. Many jihads were set in the 19th century. The result of these jihads was the formation of the Sokuto Caliphate, a giant empire in West Africa, the formation of Bornu and Kanem, the destruction of Oyo, another important empire, a Yoruba empire. And the results of all these wars was not just new political formations, but also slavery and the transport of thousands and millions of people through slave routes, through the continent, to the coast, and from the coast to the Caribbean, South America, North America, and Canada. And a big number of Hausa, Fulani, Yoruba people were sent to northeastern Brazil, where is today Pernambuco, where I come from, Salvador, Bahia, Alagoas, and many different parts. I can use here the point of my mouse of northeastern Brazil for you guys to see some places, just for you to locate yourselves in the map. It's a 19th century map. São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, here is Bahia, Salvador. So this region, especially Bahia, received thousands and thousands and thousands of people speaking the same language, although from different cities, speaking Nago, with the same cultural background, and with two different religions. Orisha worshippers, they would worship their ancestors, the spirit of the ancestors, or they were Muslims. Many of these Nago or Yoruba, or as they would be called in Cuba, Lukumi, were Muslims. And from 1807 to 1835, as Professor João Reis documented in his heavy green book, The Malezão, they organized men rebellions in Bahia, in the sugarcane plantations, in the sugarcane states. Here we have a picture of a Nago man, a Yoruba man in Rio de Janeiro. It's a photo. And you can see here the scarifications, the ethnic marks. He was from, most likely from Oyo, a very important city where people would have these marks. And just like this man in 18th century, late 18th century Canada, we also know thanks to Professor Charmaine Nelson and her research, that many African-born people were also living in Canada, and they also had ethnic marks in their face, chests, arms, a very diverse African and Black population in Canada. African-born, all born in the Caribbean and transported to Canada, US, Southern US, and many different places. But I want to highlight and remind the Canadian audience also about the African-born population enslaved in Canada, bearing ethnic marks, feeling thief, etc. So yes, 1835, that's the rebellion that we want to talk more today, and how the press talked about this rebellion, this specific rebellion. Was the last one organized by the Muslim Africans in Brazil, 1835, and this happened in the night of January 24th and 25th. That actually was the last day of Ramadan, so they were celebrating the last day of Ramadan, and that day was also the next morning was also going to be Catholic festival. So it was a perfect day, last day of Ramadan, Islamic important festival, and also most of the Catholic population in Bahia, they would be busy with their own festivities and celebration, and was a perfect time for the rebellion. But one day before this was supposed to happen, someone went to the police, and we know all the records, the people that did that actually, and told the police that a group of 100 of Muslim men were in a specific house celebrating the last day of Ramadan, and were getting ready for a rebellion. So the police went in the house, and the rebellion had to start before it was planned, because the plan was to take the city of Bahia, Salvador, and then go to the sugarcane plantations, and then really take the province, and so on. They were not able to do that. So the rebellion started. 600 men were involved in this rebellion in the downtown core of the second most important city of Brazil. It was huge. They tried to invade the prison to free one of their malans, one of their leaders. They tried to rob weapons, although they were already like collecting money and resources to buy weapons and swords. And the rebellion actually was discharged. So the police was able to control the rebellion in the morning. Hundreds of people were put in jail. Many died. Other hundreds were sent back to Africa. They were deported because many of them actually they were not enslaved anymore. They were able to buy their freedom, but they took part on this rebellion, this Muslim rebellion. That was not just a slave rebellion. Many free people also took part of that. And after the rebellion, there was a really long and detailed trial. Many books and amulets written in Arabic were confiscated. The police tried to translate, to understand more about the plans, etc. So here we have some examples from the Archive of Bahia, the Geographical and Historical Institute of Rio de Janeiro, little books and Qurans for their exercise. They could read and write. Sometimes most of the time when we talk about slavery and the enslaved population, we don't think about people who were laboring in the sugarcane fields, but they also kept books, and they had their library, they had exercises in their own language, their own religion. Was the case of the community, the Muslim community in Brazil, in Jamaica, other parts of the Caribbean, of US. So they were enslaved people, but they kept books. It was important for them, and teaching sections. And yes, a huge and big trial were set by the police. Lots of records, tons of records, people telling their stories, their kind of biographies, why they decided to go into rebellion, the reasons, etc. And the media, the newspaper press. A huge coverage was set in Brazil, different parts of Brazil. We were able to collect this information from different provinces. the Brazilians were really afraid and freaking out of the size and the organization of this rebellion. People write each other to organize something. So the Brazilian press covered this rebellion really detailed. And we are going to talk more, not just about the Brazilian press, but the international one focused in Canada. But before that, I would like to have some help from the NSCAD multimedia office to show you this video. This video is a short pic of a television series. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. A television series about the Malay Uprising, just to give you some sense of the scenario and the things happening. Actually, this is centered on the history of a woman. So it's a fiction based with some reality, you know, but it's a fictional story about a woman who denounced the rebellion to the police prior to the when it was supposed to happen. Play.
Ó povo do livro, comprometamo-nos a não adorarmos senão Allah.
Mãe, será que isso no seu rosto nunca vai sair?
Essas marcas não foram feitas para sair, minha filha. Isso diz de onde eu venho.
Lutamos para sobreviver nessa terra de branco desde o dia em que desembarcamos.
Esse aqui aguenta 16, 17 horas de trabalho duro.
Nos esforçamos para manter as nossas tradições. Apesar do chicote, dos açoites, do castigo, da pura maldade.
A sua filha pode fechar com chave de ouro o meu lote. E olha que ainda nem virou moça, né?
É hora de reagir. De Salvador até o fim do recôncavo, vamos libertar homens, mulheres, crianças, velhos, e depois o poder vai ser nosso.
Eu queria te dar o maior presente que alguém poderia ter. Vá e seja livre.
Mas aqui em Salvador não vai ficar um para contar a história. A Bahia vai ser muçulmana. A Bahia vai ser Imalê.
O delegado já sabe da nossa rebelião. Eu precisava salvar minha filha, Vitória, você sabe.
Você é uma Imalê.
Thank you. So yes, this movie was showcased, I think last year, in the Montreal Black Film Festival, the Toronto one 2 years ago. And I was the historical consultant working on this with the writers and the artists. So it was a really great pleasure and learning for me as a boring historian. So share my screen. So let's and squeeze our eyes looking at the newspapers. So yes, this rebellion really was discussed. Many articles were written in different parts of the world. We got to search in the Brazilian National Library. So while I talk, if you're curious, you can read some of some pieces from the news, London, about this rebellion. Really detailed, talking about the Quran, talking about plans and Arabic, the size of the rebellion, the British population in Brazil that was not small, many merchant houses there. 1835, so slavery was already abolished in the British domains, but they were there buying sugar, coffee, and all the items produced by slave labor, profiting from slave labor in Brazil. But anyway, so yes, we got to do a research. Actually, I have here a slide discussing methodology, and I'm going to show you soon how we got to find this information. But we did research in the Brazilian National Library, Spanish, Mexican National Library, US, the Library of Congress, many different ones in Canada. I'm going to show you. We can even compare these digital projects. You know, it's really interesting how we got in discussions and workshops around that. Dutch, Belgian, French, Hungarian, Denmark, Sweden, German, Austrian, Ukrainian, Italian, and then we were able really to, I'm going to change the slide, okay? We will see other ones. To collect really lots of news and press information about this 1835 rebellion. And while we were looking for 1835, we kind of also gave a look at some other rebellions in these newspapers. And they also covered, as you will see later, 1832 rebellion in Jamaica, the Coromantee Wars, lots about Haiti. And actually, something interesting about this 1835 rebellion in Brazil, this very important and big one, was how they would compare the Malay uprising as continental Haiti. The fear of a continental Haiti happening in Brazil. So they use this term, and it's very interesting to think about the ghost of Haiti everywhere when they would report these rebellions. And this Brazilian 1835 one was particularly important for them because they would see planning, they would see writing, they would see a community really engaged in many different ways to try to take over the second most important city of Brazil back then, one of the most important cities back then, and also a key city for the Atlantic trade. So they're really highlighting, and we can see and think about the fear when they talk about the fear of a continental Haiti. It was not just a slave rebellion. So yes, methodology. I was just mentioning that. I have here some examples of places where you can search, and we will talk by the end of the presentation about some research possibilities and ideas of doing research in the Nova Scotia archives and other newspaper archives where you can check and find the press from 18th century and 19th century from Nova Scotia, different cities of Nova Scotia. And I can tell you about 3 places already where you can find and check these materials. Of course, the Nova Scotian Provincial Archives. And I have to say that's a very hard one to search, very complicated because they don't have, how can I say, the optical character recognition. You can just search for the metadata information and then change the slides and change the images, but you can't really type, for example, Brazil, slavery, as you can do in other digital repositories, like the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales do Québec. Amazing and beautiful database. It's the best one in Canada, I would say. Best one by far, most complete and organized and user-friendly if you want to do research about slavery and other topics in Canadian newspapers. But for Nova Scotia, I would also suggest the Beaton Institute in Cape Breton, there in Nova Scotia. Amazing website. They have an very interesting archive, very user-friendly. And their newspapers there, they have the OCR, the optical character recognition, that allows you to search by terms. So it's amazing digital tool compared also with the Nova Scotia Provincial Archives. The work they did there in the Beaton Institute, great. And you see some examples there. The Google News, although it's from Google, it's not really user-friendly. It's not really easy to search and work with. But you can find materials and old newspapers, historical newspapers from Nova Scotia there. So I would suggest these three places. But we also did research on the archives of Ontario, on the online material that is being deposited there and was digitized from there. Prince Edward Island, digitized materials, also hard to search. And when I do these comparations, it's because, like, we know what you're talking about. We search in so many different places. And when I say we, I want to thank some of the people who worked with us. Actually, these people here, they are still working, but the team was way bigger. We did what we called the Canadian team search in different occasions, where we had people from different parts of the world working in this project. thanks to the support from the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery, the CERLAC at York, and other places that we were able to raise some funds and pay research assistants from Brazil and different parts of the world. I like to say, when we talk about decolonization of knowledge, that it's not just about, let's say, theory or approach, but it's also about where we spend our funds, you know? So this interaction with, let's say, the global North and the global South, for us, is really key. So we had not just Canadians doing comparative work of slavery, Canada and Argentina, Canada and I don't know, Brazil, but also Brazilians and people from Cuba and other places doing comparative work, South to the North, you know? Understanding slavery in these other parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, and then comparing with the modes, in this case, with the coverage press in Canada. So it was a kind of a go-around exercise, not just north to south, to the south, but also south to the north. And we did these workshops where we were able to collect all these materials: Fábio, Thomas, Henrique, Giovanna, Marianne, Nina, João, Gustavo, Jessica, undergraduate and graduate students working together to build up a database that I'm going to show you. And for Canada, the Canadian press, we were able to find 3 articles discussing the slave rebellion, the 1835 Malé uprising in Brazil. I have this little one translated, and you can see the details. This one from La Minerve, from Montreal, 1835, just 4 months after the uprising itself. Was really quick, the report, compared to other parts of Europe. So the Canadians were really paying attention to what was happening in Brazil. And we are going to see soon why, and it's something still to be searched and researched. But they were able to get this detailed information. And at least in this new and the next one, it was not collected from other newspapers, because it's something very usual and common to see newspapers republishing information from other newspapers. Canadian newspapers republish information from French, British, Portuguese newspapers in the international section for the news. This one, no. And I don't know how they got this information. For me, it's not clear with all these details. I'm going to move to another one because of time. If you want to check all these news, you can take notes or go back to the YouTube recorded video of this talk. This one is also very detailed, talks about Rio de Janeiro, Pará, another province, in addition to the Bahia uprising. Another one that we found yesterday while I was doing last minute fixing in this PowerPoint, another newspaper, Le Canadien, and also discuss the Bahia uprising quickly. But yes, I'm going to show you also some other news about slave uprisings in the Canadian press. But one thing that is interesting for us to discuss is these 2 next articles that explains. That was a question we had, you know, looking at the press, the British press and the French press reporting about Brazil. For us, it was clear why they were discussing and paying attention to Brazil. They had lots of merchant houses there, diplomatic consulates, the same way the Austrian, like Dom Pedro I, the first emperor of Brazil. He was married to an Austrian princess. So the Austrians were also interested in know more about Brazil. The Germans, they were buying lots of coffee, and especially coffee and other commodities, the same way the Danish, etc. But why the Canadians were paying attention to Brazil? And when we look at this news that I'm going to show you, we will understand that after 1833, the British, these are information from the British, and I think it's very interesting, because they were at the same time discussing abolition of slavery in their colonies. They did it, including Canada. They were discussing abolition of slavery in other parts. But at the same time, this one shows that instead of buying sugar produced by free hands, recently free hands from Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, they were still buying sugar and coffee from Brazil. Also the Canadians. So this news here discussed from 1835, talks about timber, the timber trade, the Canadian timber trade, and how instead of buying things from London and paying extra taxes, the Canadians were buying sugar, like from Bordeaux, wines and brandies, from Lisbon and Malaga, wine and fruits, but they were buying sugar from Brazil. It's very well documented and analyzed, the connections and the dependency of Canada from Caribbean commodities, rum, sugar, molasses, and other things. But this trade between Canada and Brazil in the first half of 19th century, it's something for economic historians to look at. But we can see the connections there in the Canadian press. When we see, for example, the merchants, Canadian merchants, buying sugar, coffee, and mocha from slave labor in Brazil after 1833 and the abolition of slavery there. So it's really hypocritical, and I would say it's well documented, also the British hypocritical behavior. But here we see the Canadian one too, and it's very interesting to think about that. You know, how slavery was abolished, but they were still profiting from slave labor in other parts of the world, while criticizing slavery in other parts of the world. So it's really ironic and strange. But this is what was happening after 1833, abolition of slavery in the British domains, but they were still profiting and buying and trading slave labor produced commodities, in this case, sugar, mocha, and coffee. And that is our beautiful database. Sad history, but we are very happy to be able to put this together, to highlight and discuss this history. We have a total of 445 entries. You can see here we are using Zotero, but the plan is really to do something more, a public history project to discuss slave rebellion, abolition, and fear. 10 different languages, 7 different metadata tags, transcription and translation. It was crazy to translate German, Dutch, Hungarian to Portuguese, but it was also fun using digital tools, Google Translator, talking to people on Facebook and other groups, you know, to check with friends in Denmark. Fabio did an amazing job with the Germanic languages. It was fun having these workshops. And at the same time, we collected this information about the 1835 rebellion. We noticed in the Canadian press, Ontario, Nova Scotia, and Quebec especially, that many other rebellions were reported. They were really paying attention to slave rebellions happening in the Caribbean and South America, prior to the abolition of slave trade and after, because Canada kept profiting from slave labor in other parts of the world. We were able to collect newspaper coverage about rebellions in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, Cuba, Jamaica, US, and other parts. And here I have just some examples. That's going to be hard for you guys to read, but you can check using the databases that we presented, we talked about by yourselves, you know, if you're interested in do more research about that. Here, some others, as you can see, slavery in Cuba, and discussing rebellion in Cuba, Saint-Domingue, Quebec, and Exitian Babiuk did a PhD dissertation, amazing. Actually was supervised also by Professor Charmaine Nelson, 2006, about slavery in Montreal, and in the Gazette de Montréal. And the coverage, actually, one chapter is about the coverage of the Gazette de Montréal about Haiti in late 18th century and early 19th century. So yes, going back here, research questions and analytical possibilities, looking at slave rebellions in the Canadian press. If you're interested in do more research about that for grad school, for undergrad MRP, be involved with the Institute for the Canadian, for the Study of Canadian Slavery, doing that. For example, I would say a research work just about the Canadian coverage about Haiti would be amazing. There is a lot, and long ones not just reporting things from French newspapers, but discussing from a Canadian perspective what was happening in Haiti. Jamaica, there is lots about Jamaica there. But I want to show just one quickly here that was really specially covered in the Canadian press, the John Brown case, Harpers Ferry in 1858. So this newspaper here is from Montreal. It's a bit slow, but it's going to show up here. Yeah, the Herald and Daily Commercial Gazette, a long one about the burial of John Brown. This one is also very interesting. John Brown, the Martyr of Freedom. This one has this volume here has 8 pages. I think 5 pages is just about the Harpers Ferry and John Brown. This one here is really interesting. I will give you 30 seconds to look at this one, because this article here allows us to allow us to discuss gender, the fear of the black man's body, in addition to abolition. Let me make it even bigger. Feeling of insecurity in the South, and fear, and white fear. So at the same time was an abolitionist kind of article, was also very racist. And these two things were not a contradiction in the 19th century, in North America, or everywhere, you know. But this one is really interesting. Talk about women, white women, and slavery, the fear of rebellion, the fear of black men. A kind of fetish, I would also think, if we want to discuss gender, sex, and fear. And this one is from November 30th, 1859, the Montreal Witness. And I think actually I am already over my 30-40 minutes. So let's go quickly to the wrap up and what I call the kind of a theoretical exercise. So yes, when we look at this newspaper coverage, and this one here, I think is also interesting, from Nova Scotia, talking about the French colonies. You guys can read from here. Martinique has 78,000 slaves, Guadeloupe, Bourbon. In this event of attack of our possessions, the English, who have now emancipated their slaves in the Antilles and the Mauritius, would endeavor to excite the black population of the French islands to insurrection. And we must acknowledge that if they were to succeed, which is not doubtful, the success would give them a formidable point d'appui for external war against us. Just another kind of tone and idea of fear of the slave rebellion. So yes, the historiography discussing abolition and slavery in the 19th century is longer. And I would talk about two main arguments. One is from a Marxist perspective that talks about abolition was needed because of the development of capitalism and industrialization and the formation of an internal market in the British possessions. So that's why the British were pushing for the end of slavery. The slave model would not fit more industrialization and capitalism. There are many arguments against that, actually. Lots of discussion around this interpretation. Another interpretation based in ethic and evangelical and Protestant ethic against slavery. Most of the leaders in England, the Quakers, so they pushed for the end of slavery based in this cultural feature, religion and morality, a new morality raising in the 19th century. But I want to highlight here, also thinking about agency and slave agency, the fear of slave rebellion as a motor for abolition was not a gift, a present from the British Empire, the French Empire, the white politics, but the slave population had a role on creating fear of slavery and keeping the slave mode. And this fear, looking at this article here, should be understood when we discuss slavery and abolition, also under the colonial dynamics. So yes, I think these are all this coverage about all these rebellions and the fear that we can feel from this news is also something to put on the table when we discuss the politics around slavery, control of slavery, the fear of a continental Haiti, abolition, and the colonial dynamics. And the Canadian press was not out of that, quite the opposite. They were particularly interested in slavery, and post-slavery, they were particularly interested in the commodities produced by slaves in Brazil and the Caribbean. And that's it. The coverage, this exercise of thinking about abolition and white fear, and the participation and the role of the Canadian press on reporting that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. So if it's possible now from the multimedia end to switch it so that people can ask a question with their voice, that would be fabulous. And if not, people can ask questions in the chat and I can monitor that and share them. And maybe to start us off, I can give a question. Which is, so I was interested in how you were saying that you had been a historical consultant on the Malay Uprising film. And I just wondered if you have ever considered maybe the role of speculative fiction in thinking through this rebellion. Because one of the things that as you were telling the story of the rebellion, that just came to mind so strongly for me is what if that had gone through the way they had planned it, and maybe even kind of, what you've demonstrated in terms of what the white fear kind of backing the press coverage is so strong, even for a rebellion that was crushed. And I just wondered, if in your research or conversations that you think about these possibilities, in sort of in a speculative fiction format of what if the rebellion had gone the other way, if it had been successful to the aims that the enslaved people had, and what you think maybe even the white reaction to a continental Haiti having happened as opposed to the fear of one.
We really started with a very hard question. Thank you, Emily. It really makes me think. And working these projects with television, fictional series, theater, dancing, I would say is very interesting for me as a historian, because let's say we would think that the historian is there to be a consultant and teach and tell them about the limits, what was possible historically, what was not possible historically, but actually working with the art director and the writer and the directors, people from the art field, get me new questions. Instead of me telling them answers and making questions, I would say there is also a way around process of the artists and how art inspire me, and that helps me to shape all the historiographical questions. For a historian, it's really hard to think about counterfactual history, something that had happened. Usually we're really trained to look at the documents and with a kind of certain limit, imagine the context, apply some historical imagination to give life and more breath to the characters and the possibilities of action there. But it's really hard for us to think about what if the rebellion worked. Maybe a way to do that is to look at the records when the police got the rebels, and ask them, what were your plans, And I would say it's really interesting to think about, for example, the Coromantee rebellion in Jamaica. People had really military training. They were kingdom makers. They were not just enslaved population, Sometimes we think about the slave as someone that lost their memory, lost their I don't know, their history, in the Middle Passage. These people kept military training, artistic skills, memories, and other things, So yes, I was talking about the Coromantee Wars in Jamaica. These people had military training. These people in Brazil, they were part of jihads, kingdom making, empire making, So for example, in a previous rebellion, not the 1835 one, when the police got the rebels, they said, no, our plan was to take over the city. Our plan was really to take over the city, to put one of our imams, one of our leaders, to be the mayor, to be the head of the city. Then we were going to invade another province. So these things make us think not just about slave rebellion, but about something bigger. These guys, they were not just rebelling. They were warriors, they were soldiers, they were kingdom makers, and what they were doing was war. It was not just a rebellion, was not just about resistance, but that was also about something bigger, that were trained and taught and did that in Africa. And when they were sent to the Americas, they were not just arms and hands for the labor on the fields, but they kept their memories, what they were doing in Africa, So it's interesting to think about these possibilities in Brazil. And sometimes, especially with the general audience, we tend to think about, let's say, good or bad. Would like this rebellion, if they were successful, would be that good, would be that bad, and it's really complex. Because slavery was also present in the Sokuto Caliphate. Many of these people enslaved in Brazil, they may had slaves back in Africa, So the 19th century was an awful time. 18th century, even worse. We tend to talk about our times as really bad, but when we look at history, we get to think more about that, Slavery was everywhere, in Africa, in the Americas, in Canada, and it's really interesting, as I did by the end of the presentation, how this was shifted, how the mentality and thinking about slavery was shifted and changed due to economic transformations, moral transformations, and fear. And it's what my presentation was really about, the coverage and the fear and the role of this fear on shaping some of these thoughts. But thank you for the question. Really also make me think more.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you have, are there any other questions from the audience? You can raise your hand if you wish to be unmuted or ask in the chat. Or, if not questions, reactions to the presentation, pieces that you're picking up specifically.
Don't be shy, you can disagree.
One of the other pieces that I really picked up on and appreciated was, I think it's easy to reconceive of abolition as that racism and abolition would be opposites. And I think it's really useful to point out kind of how these, what seem like hypocrisies now, abolish slavery in the British colonial world, and then still purchase from places doing slavery. Like, that seems out of step, but at the same time, it's not really out of step with a deep, like, white supremacist view of the world. And so I think kind of the ability to reveal how fear is fueling that hypocrisy, like when fear is being invoked, white fear of Black bodies, then those hypocrisies, then you can understand how those hypocrisies work. It makes sense to that the press coverage works in this way, that the economics are working in this way, and that abolition isn't anti-racist. So I think that that's a really useful paradigm shift for me. Yeah. Are there any other thoughts? Do you have any final thoughts, Bruno, that you felt I didn't quite get this point I wanted to make? Oh, something seems to have gone wrong. Maybe we lost Bruno.
Yeah, it looks like Bruno had some technical issues.
All right, well, we'll wait a moment to see if he comes back and gives a closing note. And if not, a funny but abrupt end to a wonderful presentation. All right, well, I guess we're at time, and our panelist has had a technical difficulty, so we'll just close out the presentation there. Thank you so much for attending today, and please stay tuned. We have 2 more upcoming lectures with our fellows, one on with Tonya Samguan Paris, which takes place on December 14th, which is a Tuesday at 6 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time. And she'll be presenting on her visual arts and giving a studio tour where she reveals the piece that she's been working on in her fellowship. And then in January, we have a presentation by our fellow Jason Cyrus, which will be about the curatorial work that he has been preparing during his fellowship. So please stay tuned to our social media for the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery to get the links to both of those upcoming lectures. And we're very pleased that folks joined today, and will watch later online. And thanks so much to Bruno for a fabulous presentation.